You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Hello again, everyone. This is Doug Thorpe, and you're listening to another episode of Leadership Powered by Common Sense. Today, my guest is going to help us understand the ability to create a safe workplace. And I'm going to borrow one of his lines, but I'm sure he's going to restate it as we get into it. He tells a story that he and his partner formed the law firm that they have with the intent of helping managers create workplaces where their kids would be safe and interested in working. And I love that vision. And without further ado, I want to introduce my guest, David Dilger. David, welcome to the show.
G'day, Doug. Thanks for having me.
And David, tell the folks where you are located.
I am way down under. So I'm in Hobart, Tasmania, which is the island off the bottom of mainland Australia. So there's kind of us, then Antarctica. So I am proper down under.
Very good, very good. Well, I appreciate you enduring the time zone changes and getting this done. But I think we finally we had a little bit of difficulty connecting and getting our schedules aligned properly. But we're now able to do this at a time that's not too wildly inconvenient for either one of us. So again, appreciate the patience getting here, David. Tell folks a little bit of the journey that you went through to get to what you're doing now with your partner and the firm you've established.
Yeah, so look, I started out straight out of school into uni, became a lawyer, went up to a firm and did the general try my hand at everything. But look, I had always had an interest in employment law. My parents were small business people. I lived and breathed the reality of a workforce in my face as much as I knew those people, and we lived and breathed the personalities at home. And then I sort of did some more study. I did an MBA, and I focused more on that HR side of things. And then I went from there to work for an employer organisation. So I've always focused for employers. And then from there, I went into a couple of national HR roles. And then from there, I became a CEO of a bakery franchise. And then from there, back into the employment, the employer agency where I actually headed up their workplace relations team. Then from there back into private practice, and then finally, as you eloquently described, my business partner and I wanted to create something where instead of going to court all the time, we actually worked directly with managers and proactively said, hey, we don't blame managers for where they get to, where they just go, we're in some sort of unfair dismissal court proceedings. We want to get managers to actually have safety for themselves and productive employees for the workplace. All of that's the win-win. But unfortunately, the way professional services tends to go is we fix it when it's broken. We don't proactively set it up for success early on. And I think there's just a number of legal lessons we can apply to proactively fix things or prevent stuff, because we've seen the worst. Like, no one wins in a court case, and that's coming from a lawyer. We don't even win. We probably are the biggest winners out of it from a monetary perspective, but I can guarantee you there's very little satisfaction in achieving an outcome at the end when you see the heavy personal toll that most of employment and safety disputes involve.
I agree with you, and boy, I echo 100% that statement about nobody wins in court. As an old banker, I shudder to think of the number of times I had to end up in court, either as a plaintiff or a defendant in trying to settle a contract dispute. And yeah, nobody ever won on those deals. And I'm like you. I guess I'm far enough along. Yes, the lawyers probably made the most money in the moment, but I could tell they weren't having any particular fun out of it either. So there wasn't a particular joy. But well, talk to me a little more. We had a very interesting discussion in the green room about the kind of the root of the impact of what happens when there might be jeopardy in the workplace, when somebody feels threatened or maybe emotionally attacked, or heaven forbid physically attacked. Talk to us, share with people what you were telling me about the views on brain chemistry and brain reaction.
Yeah, look, all of this is very much a biological response. And I think this is the change we're trying to give people of set yourself up with the environment, because the biological impact is not about being, a hard ass on one end or a snowflake on the other. Biologically, information comes into our brain into an area called the thalamus. Now, the thalamus is fantastic. It's like a big triage center, and it works out, what do I do with all this information? And it really has two choices. It can go up to your frontal cortex, and that's where our really higher order thinking goes. It's logical, it processes stuff. But the most special part of your brain, and it's the part of the brain that kept you here today, this is why you survived, is the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is often called the hijack, because if the amygdala senses any danger, risk, or something of that nature, the amygdala says to the thalamus, I'll take this one and I'll deal with it. And the frontal cortex doesn't get properly engaged. When the amygdala is engaged, it gives you four types of responses: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And fight looks like, you're a bad manager, I'm going to take you on, I'm going to make a claim. Flight looks like, I can't deal with this right now, I'm on sick leave, I've got a long-term workers' compensation claim. Freeze is a dissociative response, which is very similar to what animals do when they play dead. It is, I can't run away, I can't fight you, so I'm going to play dead so that you don't harm me. And what that looks like in a meeting is someone just giving you the rabbit in the headlights. Managers will often go, oh, David, the meeting went brilliantly, they just stood there and took it. Well, that's not really what's happening. That's a dissociative response. And then finally, you get fawning. Now, I'm all for being nice, but fawning is, again, a response of the amygdala which says, hey, let me get you a coffee, workplace bully, or here, let me, do something extra like you're photocopying, or organize something for you when you're what Bob Sutton calls the asshole boss. Okay. Now, when that happens, here's the problem. The amygdala shoots you about 90 seconds of cortisol, and it goes, just keep on doing that response for as long as the danger persists. Now, remember, the amygdala is not rational, so perceived danger will still give me that shot of cortisol. That then has a flow-on effect. Our prefrontal cortex is not engaged, our EQ stops, our immune system is compromised, because cortisol is awesome early, but not great long-term, and our memory is impacted. All of that goes into what Dan Siegel talks about when he talks about the window of tolerance. Too high, fight or flight, you're not learning or productive or effective. Too low, you're not productive, effective either. So you've got to get you in this optimal arousal zone. And Professor Gilmartin out of the US talks about, he's trying to work out, why is it that fire officers do so much better in comparison to police officers who score consistently worse in suicide, marriage breakdown, heart attack, strokes, you name it. And the ultimate decision he comes up with is, he says this: police officers are constantly having low levels of amygdala triggers. So when they start, they're going, what's going on over here? And they're constantly scanning for danger. Whereas fire officers get that great regulation. They're on, then they're off. And the body's great at having that homeostasis But if you're constantly in fear, so imagine this in a workplace, you're going, oh, here comes Doug. Oh, he looks angry. Now I get a shot of my cortisol from my amygdala. Now you send me an email. And if I'm in that state, your ability, your biological ability to perform at your peak is just significantly impacted, and it's nothing to do with willpower or anything else.
I'm thinking about that. I'm doing a stretch here a little bit, but there's one dynamic that I've seen in a lot of organizations. The leaders are pretty high energy, highly motivated, high intellect, may or may not have high EQ, but when they're in that mode, they're often intensely curious, and they'll go out in the workplace and they'll go, "Hey, David, tell me about blah, blah, blah." And you'll be put on guard to have to respond to that. And they'll go, "Great." And they'll walk away. They'll disappear. Well, just that shock and awe of that moment of that quick question puts the employee on guard. And it might not even be malicious or hurtful in spirit by any means, but just it's a kind of an attack where the person is left to speculate, am I doing something wrong? I wonder what that was about. Do I need to change gears? Do I need to do something different? What is that? So I caution leaders, when you're in that position of authority and you feel that spur to go pop a question to somebody, you need to book in the question. You need to set it up. And then you need to take it down. You need to set it up by saying, "Hey, David, I'm looking at something. I've got something on my mind. I know you're the guy working on X, Y, and Z. Can you help me here for a minute? What can you tell me about blah, blah, blah?" And then you give your answer. And then I, as the leader, would say, "That's perfect. That really fits in with what I'm doing. Thank you." And, kind of end of story. So it diffuses that whole speculation and that human tendency to wonder, what was that about?
Yeah. Look, we're training managers, and we're going, and I'll talk about the types of negative stuff in a minute. But the first thing is you've got to know your team member, right? And it's exactly what you're talking about. And you've got to now think about it in terms of the likelihood that I'm going to trigger your amygdala and give you a bad biological outcome. So here's what I say. You've got to know, when is your team member at their best? What are the conditions when they shine, when they flow? What are they good at? And does it fulfill them? Equally, what fulfills them, and are they good at it? It's a sort of double banger question. But this is where you were talking about, Doug. What are the practices and preferences, the mechanics of how you and I deal with each other that actually is going to work? Because you might be send me an email and then I look at it and I digest it. You might be on the alternative that just come into my office. You might be text me. You might be, no, save it up till we've finished work. You might be, I can't bear to wait for that meeting after work. You might be, never ever give me bad news on a Friday afternoon. Equally, you might be, don't ruin my whole week by telling me Monday morning we've got a problem. So and I'm not suggesting that what you do is you just suddenly can't ever speak to people when there's urgent situations, but I'm saying pick your time and pick your practice so the likelihood of success is higher. I can't give you the silver bullet to this one, but then once I know that, then I need to know, when have you worked and what was your role in a successful relationship, so I can understand that. And equally, what was your role in a bad relationship? Because it's easy to go, I had a bad boss and they were terrible and so I was no good either. And then finally, this is probably the most important part of it. You say, how do we fix things if we break them, right? Because sometimes if you and I know we're going to pop down the coffee shop and talk this through in private, that's going to give me a level of comfort where I'm more likely to engage my prefrontal cortex and actually give you some value. I'm not going to be regulated. I'm not coming out going, oh, Doug, what are you doing? You're a bad boss, or, why are you doing this to me? We know what this is about. And what we do know through exposure therapy, particularly around the amygdala, is once you overcome it and once you get used to things, you just become better at it. You train your amygdala. And so where I end up with a lot of workplaces, I go, if you want to work out whether you're making headway or not, just ask this simple question. The simple question is, if I said, Doug, come and see me in my office, and everyone goes, oh, Doug's in trouble, versus I go, hey, Doug, come and see me in my office, and then people go, where's Doug? And they go, oh, he's just with his manager, right? Those two questions can tell me immediately your culture, and that is, do I trust my manager has my best interest at heart? Not that they won't tell me things are going wrong, they've just got to be in it with me.
I think that's so critically important, and I like what you said there at the end about the culture that allows that thinking, like being called into the boss's office is not automatically a bad thing. It could just be a need for further dialogue or further input, further cooperation. You also, as we were talking in the green room, you talked about this notion of civility, and share with everybody the story you told me about the research with the medical profession.
Yeah, so look, there's a couple of aspects to it. I think civility, I love what Brene Brown says, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. I think HR have fallen into the trap of trying to be kind through unclearness. So we don't give people, genuine feedback. Harvard did a lot of research talking about if you're looking for productivity, your superpower is civility. Now, civility is both warmth and competence. It's not what Kim Scott calls ruinous empathy, which I'm nice all the time. And I think that's what people sometimes mistake civility for. But Harvard demonstrated that it's contagious. Incivility is contagious, but it's also likely to be productive and more effective for your employee. And the life and death moment, what you and I talked about, was the studies they did in the National Health Service in the UK. And they were trying to work out, which is very, very powerful and important work in all hospitals when they're trying to examine deaths in surgery. They're looking for root causes. And they're trying to work out, well, do we need to train people more? No, it's not that. Do we need to have better equipment? No, we've got state-of-the-art equipment. One of the critical aspects that they found, and this is why now when you have a look on the National Health Services, all of their modelling around their culture is all about civility, because what they found was civility, or incivility rather, was killing people on the table. So imagine this, you're in surgery, the surgeon's doing their work, says to one of the nursing staff, pass me that scalpel. No, not that scalpel. The other scalpel. No, not that one, you stupid idiot. When that occurs, that's civility. Now, there's a really easy way to say, no, nurse, the one to the left or something like that. But when you uncivilly use direction or criticism, it's contagious. So what happens is we know that individual immediately gets threatened. They're having an amygdala response. But what Harvard also showed us, it's contagious because the people around the person being unduly criticised or suffering that sort of uncivil feedback, they then begin to experience the threat as well. And they begin to say, I might be next. Now, we know from our earlier discussion on the studies of the amygdala, if your frontal cortex is not operating, your memory's impacted and you're dysregulated, gee, that's a recipe for disaster when you're on something as life and death as an operating table. And that's exactly why they, and I applaud them for it. I thought, what genius to actually focus on that as everyone looking for some type of silver bullet. And it was very much in what probably your grandmother and my grandmother told me is just be civil.
Yeah, yeah. It is and I think about, speaking of affairs in the U.S. now, culturally and socially, we have, I think it's fair to say we've fundamentally lost our civility. The political wranglings and wrestlings of the past so many years has just really fractured everybody's ability to look at someone who might oppose your principles and do it in a very vehement, vicious way, as opposed to just saying, I'm willing to hear what you have to say. Let's sit down and chat and have an ongoing discussion. And it's not a function of needing to win the argument, but sharing an idea. It's an art that we seem to have lost collectively here, and it bothers me greatly. And I never like to turn these shows into political statements, but it's a great example of this, how civility impacts a culture, and certainly it happens at work that way. People that are working in what most would call a toxic culture, where the boss is very belittling and very demanding, unreasonable, almost bullying. That's a lack of civility, and it's like, it's like the boss taking on the position, I'm better than you because look at me, I'm the boss, that kind of thing. And it for some it starts there. But what do you advise companies to try to do about elevating this or returning to a level of civility in their practice?
I think ultimately I've got four main practical things that I would do. And we're trying to sort of train our people on this. And that is set yourself up, self-awareness, probably the one superpower also that everyone needs to know. Aristotle said it best when knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. And I love what Simon Sinek said. If you don't understand people, you don't understand business. So from a practical point of view, when you're a manager, we say characterize more behavior as performance issues, not misconduct. Everyone seems to go to the end. You've breached this. You've failed this. And what that says to me as a manager, it says, you're cut and running. You don't think this can be fixed. You're basically going, I can't get you from here to here. You're just simply saying you're out. You're scrap heap material. So I say, focus more on something in being, hey, I'm dealing with slippage. We loved you when we recruited you, or we wouldn't have got you in the place. So how do I get you back up to there? And you've got to trust yourself as a manager to be able to do that. Or I ask people, if that's not your job, what are you there to do? The second bit I talk about is you're constantly on a seesaw balancing competency and care. Okay. Now, a lot of people will tell me I treat everyone the same, as if that's some sort of legal principle. It's not. Legal principles talk about reasonable management action carried out in a reasonable manner, and it's all based on the circumstances. So we might have an individual who is 60 years of age, has had 30 years of continuous service, has 4 dependent kids, a sick partner. Well, I'm going to balance heavily on the care factor with that person versus the other person who's been with us for 2 years, just completed the training and does the same mistake. Treating those people as if they were identical is a fundamental legal mistake, but also it just doesn't take into account what true management was about. And then I get into my next one, which is ultimately show cause people before you ever get to a termination. No one likes a surprise. No one wants to end up going, well, you just mucked up and now that's it. You want to set it all out, set the reasons out, and you're doing that for 2 reasons. One, it's fair to the individual and you might learn something that you don't know. But 2, it sends a great message of psychological safety to the rest of your team, that they're part of a team, that we treat people with respect, and that ultimately we can fix mistakes. Now, there'll be some, I accept it. We don't want people who sexually harass, steal, fraud, all that sort of stuff. Those kind of mistakes perhaps aren't forgivable from an employment perspective. But I hate seeing that we treat people who are made redundant or some minor misdemeanors being treated the same as our most heinous employment type events. And so that sends a wave of psychological fear, low levels of undercurrent. But imagine that if you're trying to improve performance and squeeze the lemon to get it out, you have just taken away biologically, and that is not just some sort of woo-woo thing. That is saying if your workforce are in fear, they cannot perform to the level that you want them to because their frontal cortex cannot be engaged at the level it should be.
Yeah. So very important to understand. And I think, equipping leaders to know more about these dynamics in the way their action can impact response from the people around them. And that's one reason I in my own coaching, I try to get leaders to contemplate and understand the difference between they as leaders reacting versus responding to a situation. Because inevitably, if you simply rely on reaction to something that happens, you are going to be triggering those fight or flight mechanisms in your people. You're going to be triggering that amygdala response rather than the frontal cortex response. But if you can respond to a situation, you can keep it in the context of the work and expectations you're trying to live with, and you can simply give an answer to what's going on. And you're far less likely to trigger those animal instincts by responding rather than reacting to situations around you.
Yeah, look, it's funny. You've given me a great little byline. For part of our coaching, we talk about 4 types of spirit animal, and they are for what I call the bear. They are the people who hibernate from performance management or dealing with people, and then they come out and basically carnage once or twice a year, trying to solve all the problems. Now, the big issue with that is they don't bring people along with them. They don't have a concern for others, and their biggest fear is loss of control or power. And that's why they act as they do. Now, they typically end up in bullying claims or some type of investigation. The second manager is what I call the dog manager. And they're called the dog manager because they love to be liked. Okay. Now, the great thing about the dog manager is they understand people, but they sometimes mistake the value of being liked over dealing with actual performance issues. So they're in that ruinous empathy sort of quadrant. They tend to be overly positive and disorganized, and their core fear is that social rejection. So if you're one of these managers, the danger for you is you look for easy wins, you look for let's do a reorganization rather than dealing with it, and you have social cliques in your environment because you play favorites. Then we have what we call the consensus manager or the mouse. Now, I'm that kind of manager, and that is what I do. Rather than I'm an avoidant manager, rather than have the performance discussion, I get on the hamster wheel myself and I go, oh, I don't want to get Doug to stay back. I'll just get on my laptop at 11 o'clock at night and I'll just fix it for him. And then what happens is these people don't fully understand their own needs, and they can be too obliging because their biggest fear is loss of stability. Now, the problem with that, again, nice to help out, but ultimately leaders like me are on the path to burnout, and equally members in your team are on the path to burnout as well, because they have to put all their discretionary effort into helping others instead of calling out the behavior. And then finally, we get to what I call the ostrich, and they're a micromanager. They don't understand people, but they love rules. And so they tend to manage in accordance with, well, what's your position description say? What's your contract say? Instead of having that fluidity of, okay, here's something that's reasonable that's not in the rules. So they have trouble seeing the bigger picture. They can be overly critical, and their biggest fear is not being competent. Now, where they tend to get trapped into is long-winded performance management processes with no intent to actually get someone to an actual result. They just want to put you in the process. And so they're going, there's me doing my job. I'm putting you in this long-winded, going nowhere process, but I'm ticking the boxes. And look, ultimately, they're the four styles. And I say, you can't be perfect. The perfect manager's the unicorn. Don't try and do that. Just do less of the bad stuff, right? There's no perfect manager, but in our styles, we each do something which is our overused strength. So for me, for example, I love consensus and I'm good at achieving it, but ultimately, if I achieve too much, that's a bad thing. So I've got to watch less of that and do more of the good things.
Yeah. Well, I think what we've talked about in an overarching theme here, maybe we haven't spoken it specific yet, is the idea of, from a leader's standpoint, it starts with developing an awareness of the impact and the sensitivities that we're describing here. And boy, if that's not a skill that doesn't usually get trained in management programs, the simple self-awareness to stand back and ask your question, I don't think I'm getting the outcome I really like. Is that really the team's fault or is it my fault? And I think it ultimately 99% of the time it is the leader's fault. And I want to touch on something you said in your quote from Brene Brown, the whole clarity idea. I'm a big fan of encouraging leaders to understand the absolute vital significance of being clear to your people. Because the way I always describe it, if you've done a reasonably good job of finding the right people for your jobs that you need, and I know that's a big if, but if you have, those people want to show up and do good work. But you have to tell them what that is. You have to show them what the right thing is or what a win is going to look like for your part of the business. And if as a leader, you can't do that, those good people are going to fundamentally go into cruise control. They're going to fundamentally do nothing because it will be against their nature to intentionally do something wrong. So their only real choice is to do nothing, and they'll find ways to do nothing until you can show up and give them the path forward and a good, clear definition of what the expectation may be.
Absolutely. I think that quiet resignation is one of those ones that is the real sleeper. So I go, how's Doug going? I don't have anything wrong with Doug, but ask me what other good things that Doug has been doing, and I can't tell you anything either. And that's because Doug's become a seat warmer. He's just probably in that hypo-arousal, which is I'm freezing or I'm fawning. I'm just making sure I don't make any mistakes, but I'm sure as hell not reaching or trying to reach the effective performance I'm capable of. And that's a dangerous place to be. And it's kind of infectious as well, that individuals pick up that and they go, that's rewarded because I'm not being yelled at, I'm not being called into the manager's office. But unfortunately, it's just not effective.
Yeah, I agree. Well, David, I think we're about up on time for today. Thank you so much for sitting in. I think this is great. Tell people the best way to get a hold of you if they're interested in knowing more.
Oh, I'd love to hook up with people on LinkedIn. I put out, when I meet my KPIs, I put out an article at least once a week talking about this sort of stuff. I look at cases, I look at trends all around the world. So look me up on LinkedIn. If you can't find me there, I'm at www.edgelegal.com.au.
Very good. Well, one last time, David, thank you so much for sitting in with us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
You bet. Well, folks, this is the part of the show where I like to remind you we do have a video version of this over on YouTube, channel by the same name, Leadership Powered by Common Sense. Hop over there, check out the archives, and leave us some comments. Ask us a question if you like. If you've got a recommendation for a new show or a different guest, let me know that too. Would love to hear from you. And if you want to reach out to me for help with your business leadership, you can reach me at my website, Doug Thorpe, THORPE.com. All of that, again, will be in our show notes. So feel free to hop down there and mash the buttons and do what you need to do to get a hold of us. With that, we're going to sign off, say goodbye, go out there, make it a great day.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.